Welcome to CS50 week 9, our last section of new content. This week we're tackling Flask, which is a web development framework in Python, where we're going to be able to integrate everything we've learned from Python week to SQL to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to now create these more interactive web applications. So I'm Kelly, I'm one of the preceptors here at Harvard, and that is my email. And so today with Flask, we're actually going to be doing this in a fairly hands-on way, where we're actually going to be working through the first portion of the problem set, birthdays, and using this as a way to walk through all the different parts of Flask and how we can now integrate Python, SQL, and HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to create an interactive application like this, where we have a birthdays form. You can add a name and someone's birthday, and then press add birthday to have them display in your list of all these people's birthdays. So first I'll talk briefly about this model that we talked about in lecture a little bit, where first we have the view of the web application we have. And so that is simply just this website, right? So rendering the site is what you see. Then we have the controller, which is basically the functionality of adding this button, right? This add birthday button, where we're giving some information and we're doing the logic to take that birthday. And then we have the model, which is the underlying information that we're keeping track of. And so that is how all of these birthdays that we've now saved the information of are being displayed on the page after you've updated it with a new birthday. And so this MVC model is just sort of a way for you to think about the ways that a web application is functioning and how those three components, where we have the front end, the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, then the back end, which you're going to be writing in Python, and how you have SQL, which is going to be the database that's storing all that information. So these three pieces work together to create this sort of functioning, interactive web application. So if we dive into birthdays itself, we can see that the structure of the folder, if you download the distribution code, looks a little bit like this. So we have a birthdays folder, and then within that we have two folders, one called static and one called templates. And so within static, this is like just convention to have the styles.css file, which contains all of the styling for your site. So if you saw earlier, here, that's what gives us these nice blue colors, the nice font, and any of the other sort of styling things that you see here. Then with templates, that's where all of our HTML files live, or our templates, so to speak, and that's what will be rendered to the user on the web, the view side of things. Then we have app.py, which is our Python file that contains that back-end logic of updating the table and when users submit the form, what happens. And then birthdays.db, which is our database that's storing all of those birthdays. Okay. Any initial questions about birthdays or this idea of Flask and how it creates these web applications? Okay, so in that case, we'll continue and talk a little bit about routes first. So as we saw, or as you've probably seen if you've used any sort of website, is you typically have this backslash at the end of your link. And so that is basically what we are calling a route, right? So this would be maybe your home page or just that first page that comes up, but you can also add different routes. And so for example, maybe for our birthdays site, we have a /add route, which we would use when a person fills out our form and adds a new birthday. And so in Python, when we're actually writing this, we have this app.route notation, and that specifies the functionality of what should happen when someone uses that specified route. So for example, if we're just on this index page, the home page, and a user navigates to just the backslash route, so nothing behind that, then what we probably want to do is just return that index page and render it to the user. And so as we saw in lecture, we're able to use this render template function that comes with Flask, and that takes in a template or like an HTML file as we saw, and it will render that to the user. We also have a somewhat new command here, Flask run, which is what we're going to be using to run our web applications. Okay. So then with forms, this is how we're actually adding some of that interactivity, right? So right now we just saw how you can render an HTML file and see that website live, but we already sort of saw that in week 8. So forms is really these are how we're able to get that interactivity in. So to preface, what we saw was we had 2 different request methods, post and get, and this is when we're sending data to a server versus when we're requesting data from a server. And this is also how we're going to be able to differentiate what functionality comes with which methods. So just as a summary, post is used to send data to a server to create or update a resource. So you can think of it as sending new information, updating something, whereas get is used to request data from a resource. So in our birthdays example, get requests would be if I just navigate to the website. So I'm just seeing what's on there. And a post request would be sent for when I press that add birthdays button. So I'm sending information to the server, and then it's going to update accordingly. So for a few examples, if a user goes to a website and lands on the /login page, what request method would this be? Post or get? So they just navigate to this website. So I'm seeing some debate. So this would be a get request if I'm just going to the website. But if I did press login and I gave it my information, like this is my username, this is my password, then that would be a post request. So just going to the page itself and rendering that page would be a get request. The wording can be a little bit confusing, but yeah, so get is when I'm getting information and trying to render it per se. A user enters their username and password and clicks login. Like I sort of just spoiled this one already, but this would be a post request because I am entering information, and then that information is going to the server and say updating something, or in this case, logging the user in. For our birthdays example, if a user submits a birthday, what would this be, get or post? Yeah, so I'm mostly saying post. That's right. So when you submit a birthday, you're also submitting a form, right? We're giving some information to the server, and then it's going to update our site accordingly. Okay. So when we actually see these in code, they're going to look a bit like this on the HTML side. So we can create an HTML form element. And then these 2 pieces of information are important to include, where we have action and then the route that we're requesting. So this directly matches up with the Python code where you're specifying the functionality for a certain Python route. And then we have the method, so which request method it's using. Within a form, you can have various elements, for example, an input or a button. So in this birthdays case, we might have an input called that we are calling on the back end name or friend. So this name doesn't specify anything on the viewer side, but now we have a name for whatever is going to be inputted into this text field. Then we have an input that's type number. So user is going to submit some number, and then we know that this input is going to be titled month. Then we have a submit button, and when you specify the type as submit, that also helps with like the back end. It doesn't necessarily change anything visually, but specifies that we're going to be submitting the form when this button is pressed. So yeah, this submits the form when clicked. Okay. Any questions about forms so far? Routes? Okay. So now we're gonna move over to VS Code and actually get a sense of what's going on here in the code. So I'm in my birthdays folder right now. If I do ls, I can see what we saw earlier, my templates folder, my static folder, app.py, and birthdays.db. Okay, we have a question about what makes a type different than a class. So a class, that's a great question. A class is a user create or a programmer created thing. So typically for using for styling, if I want certain elements to be styled a certain way, then I can apply a class to that. However, a type is much more, at least meaningful on the back end, where specifying this type as submit will then signal to my back end that when this button is pressed, then this form itself should be submitted. Okay, hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so let's dig into birthdays a little bit. First, I'm just gonna show you what is going on here in the static folder. So we have our style sheet here, and you can see something you're hopefully familiar with, the CSS syntax of like body, and then I'm applying some selectors like background color, font size, etc. We aren't going to do anything with this today, but just so that you can see, these are some of the selectors and the ways that our styling is applied on birthday. Okay. And then if we go to templates, we can see our index.html page. So this is what is being rendered to the user. We have our head, which imports a font. And then we're linking this to our style sheet, and we have our title. And then you can see the things that we have rendered, like birthdays. And then we have a currently to do. So if I actually go back here and I run Flask run. All right. So currently the way I have birthdays from the distribution code, we only see this heading and then a header for add a birthdays and then a blank table for all birthdays. So we're going to be implementing the functionality of being able to add a birthday and then having those birthdays show up. So the first thing we want to do actually is on index.html, we're going to add a form to be able to submit these new birthdays. And so the form should have these following traits. The form should submit to the default route using the post method. The form should include a name, a month, and a day. And then the form should include a button to submit the form. Okay, so let's get started with this then. So here under add a birthday, we're going to create this form. So I know that I can use the form tag like I saw earlier. And so we'll have the open and close form. Okay. Or actually, this should be on the same line. Okay, and then we, within this, are going to specify our action. So this is going to be just to the default route. and then our method, which is going to be post. Okay. Now within that, I know that I want name, month, and day. So what would those elements be? What tag should I use? Yeah, input. Okay, great. So within my input, I should specify a few things. So first, the name of this input so that I'm able to distinguish the output from the others. So maybe I'll just call it name. I could also call it maybe friend, but I'll do name for now. And then there are some other attributes I can also add to this. Some might be, right, if I just have the form, then we see it's just an empty form here. However, maybe I want some placeholder text so the user knows what I'm supposed to input here. So I can actually specify placeholder to be name, or like enter name, something like that. If I refresh this, you'll see that placeholder text coming up, which is awesome. Yes, and then we should also have the type, which is going to be text here. Okay, great. So I'll just keep name for now, and then we're going to also include a month and a day. So let's create two more inputs, one for the month and one for the day. So I'm going to call this one month, call this one day, and also update the placeholder text. And then these should be a number instead. And right now, the user could probably enter any number here, but what about that might be not great design? What could go wrong here? Could give a type error. So if somebody tried to type in, say, the month, maybe that wouldn't work. Yeah, so some people are saying if you put 14 as the month, that doesn't actually exist, and so that's not a valid birthday. So maybe we can add some front-end logic to just try to at least prevent that. So maybe for month, I could say the minimum number they can enter is a 1, and the maximum they can enter is a 12. For day, it's going to be a little bit more difficult since I could add the logic to check for every single month and how many days are in each month, but maybe for now I'm just going to say minimum is 1 and then our maximum is 31, even though this technically you could also make dates that don't exist. Okay, but even with this, my min and my max, is there a way of getting around this? So maybe I'll actually try to demonstrate this, but let's say I come here now, I have my name, my month, my day, which is awesome. If I say okay, this is fine for now. Let's actually try it after we've added our add button. So let's include our submit here. And I saw a question earlier about the difference between an input and a button. And there's no real substantial difference. Like you could do it both ways. So I'll actually demonstrate this with an input type element with submit. And we're going to specify add a birthday. And we'll see that this actually creates sort of the same thing as a button, right? It looks pretty much like a button. And with that type submit, we're going to be able to submit all of this information within the form. So let's say I have this filled out. I press add a birthday and it seems like it's worked. If I tried to give it an invalid month or an invalid day, say 50, then we can see we get this little error here that says value must be less than or equal to 12. And so there is a way of getting around this, right? If I go to inspect element and I look for this form, you can see these things that I've specified here, right? So I could actually just go in and change this to my max should be 100, and this should also be 100. And then if I resubmit it, we can see that it actually did go through. And so this is just an example of how if you actually want to have any of this logic implemented, that needs to happen on the back end. So just having these front end like checks aren't actually going to prevent malicious actors. So you should always be doing that logic of preventing invalid input on the back end. So we'll see that in a second when we move to app.py. Okay, so seems like we've made our form. Any questions about creating form here and what we've done just now? Okay, feel free to put any questions in the chat, but we'll keep rolling here. So that was our front end here. Oh, someone asks how to change. So if we wanted to move this button, that would be a CSS. That would be a CSS change. So you could change how things wrap. Right now, if we wanted to actually look into it, let me see if I can pull up. Okay, there we go. Two terminals here. Okay. So, like I was saying, so if we wanted to actually look at how things are styled, you can go into the static and look into styles.css. And so this section is called, we have given it a class section. So if I actually looked into my style sheet here, we could find section here, and we can see all of the CSS selectors that are being added to that. And so also for inputs and for submit, we can see, yeah, all of this is being applied to the button that we've given this, so you could use an input or a button here, but it applies this CSS logic to it. And so if we wanted to change that, we definitely could. But yeah, that's all in the CSS. Yes, placeholder here is just referring to this text that you see on the input itself. Yeah. Someone else also asks, is there another way to send a post request other than through a form? At least for now in CS50, we're just going to cover sending it through a form with this post method. And for, I think, at least this framework of us using Flask, Python, and HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that's probably going to be the most straightforward way for us to do it for now. But yes, great question. Okay. So we've just talked a lot about this front end, so capabilities using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But now to get into some of the more interactive pieces, we're going to see how this connects to what we did in week 7, which was SQL. So we have our app.py written in Python and our index.html sort of working together here, where in our app.py, we can use request.form.get with a parameter of the name to get a certain input from the form that we've submitted. And so when we specified the name of each input, so in this case we had name, month, and day, that will then correspond to how we're going to get that input in app.py. And so from that, we can also do some queries just like we saw in SQL. So let's say here, now that I've submitted this information, I've got name, my month, my day. What do I actually want to do with it? Well, I want to insert that information into my birthdays database so that I have that in memory, and I'm then able to show it on the main page. So to insert it, our SQL notation is very similar to what we saw in SQL week. We have insert into the name of the table, and then the columns values, and then the name of the values. And so when we're writing it in Python, we're going to see something a bit like this, where we have db equals SQL and then the name of the SQLite database. And so this creates sort of this object, this db, that you can now run db.execute on with your SQL query. So if I run db.execute select star from birthdays where month question mark equals month, what would this return? We're selecting star from birthdays where month equals question mark month. So we're returning, so within our SQL query, we're selecting everything, which means all of the columns, from birthdays. And then we're filtering it where month equals, and then some variable, which is this question mark is a placeholder for a variable. And we've passed in this month variable. So this would return to us the rows in birthdays where month is equal to the month that we submitted in the form or whatever month is equal to. If I also specified where month equals question mark and day equals question mark, so now passing in the month and the day, then this would return to me all of the birthdays that are this exact month and day. So all of the rows with the same month and day. So maybe this is useful if I want to only render, or I'm looking to check if there's anyone with the same birthday or the same birthday month. But yes. So using that as an example, now we're going to go into app.py and insert a new entry to the birthdays table of birthdays.db. We're going to use request.form.get to get those values, and then we're going to use db.execute to insert those into the birthdays table. And then like we talked about earlier, we're going to make sure we validate user input. So making sure that the value is none, or in our case, if we're checking for a month, we might want to check that that is actually a valid month that the person has inputted. Okay, so let's move into app.py. And we can see, let me hide this. Okay. So within app.py, we have a lot of things we might not have seen before, but for the most part, it's not too new here. We have Flask, which is this web development framework that we're using, and from Flask, we're able to import a lot of these functions that are going to be helpful to us. For example, render template we just saw, and request is how we're going to be getting the values from the form. And then we can see also here, we've declared DB, configuring it to use the birthdays.db database. Okay, so here's where we're going to be doing most of our work here. We have our app route, which is this default route. And then we've specified that it can use the get and the post methods. If we didn't specify that, we would run into some error that would say invalid request method or something like that. Okay. So for now, we want to tackle this first bit where if the user accesses this route via a post method, meaning they've pressed add birthday and they are giving us some information, then we want to actually get this form data. So like we just saw, we're going to get this using request.form.get. So I'm going to create a new variable called name, and that's just going to be equal to whatever the user puts in as this name input field. So to reiterate, this name input also has to match up with the name of the input on the HTML side. So if I changed this to friend, I would also have to change this to friend. Oops. So let me change it back to name for now. So I'm going to do the same thing with month and day. So month, day. Okay. And so now I've gotten these variables, name, month, and day, and that is supposedly holding whatever the user gave to me in those input fields. Okay. Like I said here, I want to make sure that I validate user input. So making sure that something is not none. So maybe for name first, how would I check that name is not none before I insert it? Yeah, so I could check name, if name is none, or you could just say if not name. So this would be true if name is none. So if not name, then what should I do here? Yeah, I could redirect. So this would just take them back to the main page. But what if they don't know what happened? They think that it just worked. Yeah, we could give like an error message or something. So right now, it seems like we don't really have a place to put this. But maybe I do how inform them of their error. Yeah, exactly. I can send some message. Maybe for now we can just, yeah, so you could return it to a new page that's like an error.html page. But just for the sake of time, we could do that. But for now, let's just redirect and say, like, as an improvement, we would add an error message page that would include the error that they made. Okay, let's also validate these other two. So month. Should definitely check if it's not null. But I could also here validate for some other things, right? So I could say or if month is less than 1 or month is greater than 12, then that should also be an error. Yeah, that's great. So someone else said I could also do or month in range 12. Yeah, so since it's exclusive, it would not include 12 if I did 12. So you could do it both ways. And then we could do the same thing for day. Change this to 31. Okay, and then let's see what happens right now if I say give it a invalid month or day. Okay. So let me override this max. And here, okay, so we see we have type error, not supported between instances of str and int. So what's going on here? I think someone already said it in the chat, but month and day here are strings, but we're trying to compare them to integers, which is not working. So how would I fix that? Yeah, we could try casting it. Yeah, so maybe for now, let's say these, you could try combining these three. So or not month or not day. And then once we've confirmed that none of these are none, we actually have some values in each of them, then one way we can do this conversion is actually using a try except, right? So there's a possibility that we run into a value error if they, typed in a string. So I can do name equals, oops, not name, month. Try to convert the month to an integer. And then maybe we check is if month is less than 1 or month is greater than 12, then return redirect. Maybe we can just print in the terminal like none input is empty or something like that. In this case, could print invalid month. Okay, could also maybe do day here. So try converting this to a day, and we can copy this for a day. And so you could also add more logic here that checks for, maybe if month is 2, then day can only be, 28, but then it gets rather complicated with leap years and all that. But that is logic that you could implement here. Okay. How does this look? Let's see. Except value error. Oh, yes. Then we should also return. This is not. Okay. So this is definitely a starting point here. We have this. Let's say I put in nothing and I just press add. Then what do we see here? Oh. $45, we check if this is. Okay. Let's see. Cast. So maybe this cast didn't work. Okay. Well, let's come back to this. But for now, maybe I can just remove the try except and just cast it directly here. date, month. Yes. But yeah, so this is all like programming decisions that you have to make of like how much are you going to trust the user. In most cases, you probably shouldn't trust the user too much, as they can always get around these sorts of things. So let's see, what do I have here? Invalid, literal for int. Let's see, does anyone know what's going on here? Am I with this int function? Okay. I think it might actually be someone correct me if I'm wrong, but anyways, let's come back to this and actually move to, so here we've actually just checked that it's none, which is good. And then we want to definitely do something here that checks the actual values of these things, but we'll come back to that. If we do, for now, we're going to actually insert these values, name, month, and day. So insert into birthdays, and we're going to give it the month, name, month, and day, values. And then rather than giving it the values directly, like we said, we want to use this library to sanitize that input. So that protects us from SQL injection attacks. So it gets rid of any scary characters before adding it. Okay. And so I can also go into my database if I actually want to see what my table looks like. So you can see birthdays has, each row has an ID, a name, a month, and a day. All right. So let's see if this works for now, if I use it correctly. So if I press add, then it looks like nothing happened, but maybe if I check my database here and I select to start from birthdays, let's see. Okay. Okay, yeah, so we see what I just added there is now showing up in my database. So this is great, this is working. Again, we'll come back to that maybe at the end here. Okay, so this adds the user's entry to a database, which is great. Now let's talk about the final piece, which is rendering this on the page. So I right now can add whatever I want, but nothing is showing in my actual table. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we can use this render template function like we've seen before. And on the app.py side, we're going to give as input the template that we want rendered. And then you can also pass in certain elements. And then we can use this thing called Jinja, which we saw in lecture, as a way to dynamically update this HTML. So this message is message. So this would actually render us just the message is hello on HTML side. We can also pass in lists, for example. So if I had some page index.html and I passed in a list, then on the HTML side, I can do this Jinja for loop, where we loop through each item in the list, and then maybe for each item, we have just a paragraph tag. So this would print out apple and banana on HTML side. We can also do dictionaries. So if I have a birthday dictionary, I can use the dot notation as well on Jinja and have birthday month is, and then the birthday month, which is Feb. So that would show birthday month is Feb on the HTML side. So just to recap, Jinja expressions. So if you're doing a for loop, or anything that's not just one variable, you would use this curly brace % notation. And if you're just doing one variable, so like birthday.month or message, then that would be the double curly braces. Okay. So let's do this final piece where in app.py and index.html, we're going to query for the birthdays and then display them in our table. Okay. So we're going to be working here where under this table, we'd like to render each row. And then we'd also like to, let's see if I can, I don't want to lose it this time, so I'm just going to do that for now. Here's our table, and then here down in the get request, this is where we're going to be displaying the entries. Okay. So it's kind of up to you which order you want to do things in. I think I'm going to start with app.py, where I'm going to actually ask the database, so db.execute, and get all of the birthdays from our database. So maybe I create birthdays, db execute, and I'm going to select star from birthdays. Okay. And what would this be now? What is birthdays going to be? Yeah, so this returns a row of, or a list of dictionaries. Each dictionary will include the ID, the name, the birthday, with the month and the day. So just like we saw in the database here. So given that, then I can maybe pass that in here and say birthdays equals birthdays. So now I know that on the index.html side, I'm working with this list of dictionaries called birthdays. And so that's important to remember when I'm doing this on the HTML side. So right now I have my T body, so table body. And I know that I want to use a for loop with my Jinja syntax. So what I'm going to do is for birthday in birthdays. So birthdays is this list that we have over here. So you have to make sure that those names match up. And then within that, we have end for, so it knows when to stop the looping. And so basically anything we put within this will be repeated for each item in our birthdays list. So for each item, I know I want a row in my table. So I'm going to do tr. Tr. And then within that, I want a table data for the name and then the birthday. So we saw here it's set up for name and birthday. So how would I do the name? I'm going to use this Jinja syntax, pass in some variable, right? Yeah, so I'm going to use birthday, which is one element in my list. And as we recall, db.execute gives me a list of dictionaries. So I want birthday, but specifically birthday.name to get the name from that dictionary. And then I can do something similar for the birthday itself. If you recall, we saw as a photo of what it should look like at the very beginning here. We saw that the birthdays, we actually want them to be rendered like so. So 7/31, 3/1, like so. So in my code, I want like the month, and then a slash, and then the day. So I could do something pretty similar here and say birthday on month. And this slash will just render normally. And then birthday dot day. Okay. Any questions about what we just did here with rendering this list? So we can test this out. So now I can see all of these things have come up. So if I add John, his birthday is March 31st. We can see that updates down below, which is awesome. We can also see some of maybe the things that we haven't protected for. So right now, if I just press add birthday, nothing happens. Or actually, no, it does include a empty list. So we don't want that. And so those are some of the things we have to protect against and do some of that logic on the back end. If I just inserted David with no month or day, again, that would show up, but we don't maybe necessarily want that. So that's also just a choice on the programmer end. Maybe you do want to allow that, maybe you don't. So that's all logic that you should implement on the back end. Maybe in our last few minutes, let's try to see if we can fix some of those things. So let's see. This should be return redirect. Okay. So now maybe hopefully we should see if I just input nothing, then it does not add a new thing because we've just found that it's empty. Let's see, did it print? Yeah, so it printed here. We can see input is empty. And so it just did not add it for us. Okay. And then maybe for this other portion, let's see. Okay, oops. Okay, let's try this part again here. So now we know return is missing here. And if someone wants to check the proper syntax for casting, that would be helpful. Okay, let's see. Okay, that's all right. Okay, so it is in month. Okay. Okay, let's see what happens here if I refresh. Okay. Okay, let's first test the case that I put in text instead. So I'm going to override this, say I'm going to actually put in text. Okay, so we can see that it didn't show up in the table, which is good. And let's see if that message printed. Ooh. Okay, and then we saw not an integer, which is awesome. So we can see these are some ways that you're able to catch these so that the user doesn't input anything that they're not supposed to, even if they're able to like go into inspect and change maybe the maximum month to something that's not possible. So 99th month. You can see if I add that again, we'll see invalid month here and that it did not add to our table. Okay. Any questions about what we just did here? What happens if there's an error in the SQL command, like inserting a null value where it shouldn't be null? That's a great question. So here with db execute, if this failed, then I believe it just would not run. So like you just wouldn't see it inserted. For things like select, sometimes you could check if the birthdays, before passing it through, you could check maybe if birthdays is empty. So if not birthdays, then maybe you want to catch something, you want to do some error handling, you can do that. But more or less, yeah, you would not get an internal server error, but it would just maybe not work the way you're expecting it to. Okay. All right. Well, so we just created this birthdays functioning application, and you saw how we were able to first add this form, and then we were able to add some of that logic to catch all of the conditions for user input, and then we were able to render the table down here. So those 3 parts of creating a functioning web app. Okay, and then in that case, that is, I'll wait to the end of, there we go. That is the end of week 9 section on Flask. Thanks for coming each week, and I hope that this course has been helpful for you.